Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us, whether you're in the room or whether you're online. Excuse me. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Dr. Anjamarie Hancock, and I'm the Executive Director of the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity at The Ohio State University. We're thrilled to have you here, whether you are a regular or whether this is your first time at our semester lead forum series. So the Kirwan Institute hosts a forum series every semester. This year, we've got 9 great events lined up. So be sure to check the rest of them out on our website. But this morning, I'm very sorry I can't be there with you in person. I woke up with a cold, and I think one thing the pandemic has taught me is it's really important to keep other people safe. And so happy to be able to have this Zoom conversation today with 2 incredible scholars who are relatively early in their careers, but I think what you will see is that their thinking is not. These are 2 brilliant and amazing women that I'm thrilled to say are part of the Kamala Harris Project. The Kamala Harris Project is actually a nonpartisan, I'll say that one more time, a nonpartisan scholarly research project that began in 2021 on the day that Kamala Harris was inaugurated as the first woman of color to ever serve as Vice President of the United States. And so what we have is a tremendous opportunity as scholars to really examine and explore from an interdisciplinary perspective the intersections of race and gender in a host and a variety of ways. And so a couple of years ago, we had a symposium at a different institution, and now we are pleased to be here at Kirwan at The Ohio State University. And I'm thrilled to present to you Dr. Brookyne Gipson and Dr. Danielle Lemi. And each one of them will make a presentation, and then we will hold all the Q&A for both scholars until the end. So let me do the introductions, and then I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Gipson, and then Dr. Gipson will turn it over to Dr. Lemi. So first, what can I say about Dr. Brookyne Gipson? Brookyne Gipson is an assistant professor of communication at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. She's an interdisciplinary scholar whose areas of research include digital and social media environments, Black feminist digital technology studies, and the intersection of race, gender, social media, and power. Her work examines how social media platforms facilitate civic engagement within Black communities. Her current research takes an intersectional approach to analyzing how anti-Black discourses manifest themselves in everyday discursive exchanges within Black social media spaces. She obtained her BA in History and African American Studies from UCLA, and then her master's and PhD in Communications and Digital Social Media from the University of Southern California. We are also pleased and thrilled to have Dr. Danielle Lemi. And Dr. Danielle Lemi is a John Tower Center Fellow at Southern Methodist University. She is a scholar of representation in American politics with a focus on identity, race, and gender. She uses experimental and elite interview methods to apply theoretical frameworks of identity and group behavior to questions of voter behavior and legislative politics. Her work has been published in Politics, Groups, and Identities, the Du Bois Review, the Journal of Race, Ethnicity, and Politics, PS, Political Science and Politics, British Journal of Political Science, and Perspective on Politics. With Dr. Nadia Brown, she is the co-author of Sister Style, The Politics of Appearance for Black Women Political Elites, a fantastic book that I highly recommend. Her research has been supported by the NSF, the APSA Latino Scholarship Fund, and the Peter G. Peterson Foundation. She received her PhD in political science at UC Riverside in 2017, and she grew up in the East Bay of California, where she was a Ronald McNair Scholar and a first-generation college student. So as you can see, we have 2 very, very incredible scholars here today. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Gipson for her presentation, and then we'll carry on to Dr. Lemi.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to just go ahead and share my screen that I have been testing all morning because I had a little tech issues. I usually transfer my slides over, but I'm going to be streaming from Canva. Everyone can see that okay, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much again for that warm introduction. And I'm really excited to be speaking with you all today. I'm going to be sharing just a little bit of a sliver of some of the insights from a book manuscript that I've been working on. And it's on the emergent phenomenon of networked misogynoir in digital spaces. So just to give you a one line, and I'm going to go on a deeper definition in a second. But to give you the one-liner, this is specifically thinking about how communities form in online spaces around content that vilifies Black women. So it's the memes, the meme aggregator pages, it's the podcasts, it's partially the manosphere, but it's all of the content that deals in these tropes, which is something that happens within Black spaces, but stems from white supremacy and white supremacist discourses. So it happens in non-Black spaces as well. And it's also so prevalent that it's not just something that you see men engaging in. You also see this in some corners of Black women's online activities. So you can think about the Black hypergamy pages or the femininity coaches that are teaching Black women that in order to self-correct for harmful stereotypes about them, they need to overcorrect themselves. So instead of being and to combat the stereotype of being loud and angry, you need to be quiet and speak when spoken to. So very inherently problematic stuff, but a lot of it deals in these tropes related to misogynoir that the average person doesn't really have necessarily a language for. So they're able to repackage and represent these ideas for a new generation, which is really scary because so much of this is just classic historical manipulation. But just to give you a little bit of background on myself and how I got to this specific project, my research tends to focus on how Black communities engage with politics and social media, particularly in relation to mis and disinformation. And as an intersectional scholar, I find quite a few problems in the area of mis and disinformation. As a comm scholar, primary amongst them is this idea that critical media literacy is a cure-all. The critical media literacy is obviously extremely important, but what's most difficult about it is that everyone kind of defines it differently. And then also, when it comes to traditionally marginalized groups, there's often this dismissive or paternalistic tone. Oh, they don't know better. Oh, they're just being irrationally afraid. They need to just read the right information. And so it oftentimes, especially in terms of Black communities, I notice that people want to say that Black people are just irrationally distrustful of the government, like of government institutions for no reason. But for those of us who are more familiar with what Black Americans have gone through in this country, it's actually extremely rational to be a little nervous about what's going on in the world, especially when you've been disenfranchised from a lot of political information. And so while I do advocate for critical media literacy programs, I advocate for those that also honor subjugated knowledges. So that we could take more of a holistic approach to understanding what is actually happening. And to that end, my slides are not advancing, let me see. To that end, I also try to consider what it means to think about some of the rumors and mythologies and conspiracy theories that circulate in Black social media spaces as ethnosociologies. And I take this framework from Anita Waters, and she refers to ethnosociologies as theories that ordinary people use to explain social phenomena. Conspiracy theories may be understood as one class of ethnosociology. They explain social misfortunes by attributing them to deliberate, often secretly planned actions of a particular group of people. But this can be extended to all sorts of narratives that might not be completely well informed, because at the end of the day, even if the narratives aren't 100% true, they're still rooted in some sort of truth. So in my presentation today, I'm kind of talking about this methodological approach to thinking about how we're thinking about analysis. In recent years, I've noticed a trend, and that is the use of emotional provocation as a disinformation tactic in social media spaces, meaning that it's really easy to get you to believe something when you're already happy, angry, like you're having some sort of emotional response. And so I see a lot of people leveraging that as a disinformation tactic. Um, in particular, I've noticed lots of stereotypes, lots of techniques that leverage stereotypes of Black women. And these stereotypes are rooted in anti-Black discourses and are mostly intended to incite fear and create moral panics around some common narratives I've seen in the Black digital space is around protecting or saving the Black family, which sounds like a very noble thing on the front end. But on the back end, a lot of this rhetoric devolves into, well, in order to, save the Black and protect the Black family, we have to revert back to these 50-year-old archetypes of gender roles and things that are really limiting for folks who are trying to be more progressive with their identity and with their politics. And so I find that many of these false narratives are characterized by patriarchal perspectives of proper roles for Black women in society, proper in quotes. And much of the discourse can honestly be reduced to reactionary anti-feminism, which is on the rise due to increased visibility of feminism and a host of other reasons. But in my particular book project, I go in depth on various case studies of Black women who've been the victims of kind of these like networked harassment on the basis of identity and stereotypes of Black womanness. So I talk about comedian Leslie Jones and the pushback after the movie, the Ghostbusters movie was released, and how a lot of people organized on Reddit and 4chan, these are white supremacist groups, to attack her and assault her verbally and push her temporarily off the Twitter platform. I talk about the responses to rapper Megan Thee Stallion being shot, and also the case kind of playing out in digital social media spaces and the rhetoric around that, and many other case studies. And for the purposes of today, I'm going to talk about one specific event, and that is Kamala Harris's presidential candidacy announcement. I did a project where I pulled data from those first 24 to 48 hours after she announced that she was running for president, and then also some data after, I feel like it was about a week or so later, where she appeared on The Breakfast Club, which is not a podcast, it's a radio show, a Black radio show hosted out of New York. It's a morning show, and she had some commentary there that people responded to strongly. And this is a particular snapshot in time because I feel like the conversation around Kamala Harris within the first 24 to 48 hours is very different than 72 in the next month and the next year. But a lot of that initial reaction to Kamala Harris has stuck and played out in a way that has propagated a lot of mis and disinformation about Kamala. And so I want to repeat again the sentiment that this is a nonpartisan study. And I want to, in this project, distinguish between legitimate critiques of Harris's politics, as there are many, and the distinct form of misogynoir that followed her announcement. These are not necessarily one and the same, but what I've noticed is that people tend to conflate them. So because this project is primarily rooted in the attacks on her identity, when I'm having conversations with people, they'll bring up the political stuff. And I'm like, well, yes, all of that is fair. But what's not fair is to weaponize people's identity in particular ways to attack them. And that is what I'm focused on specifically in here. Okay. So I will discuss some of the themes that emerged out of the discursive elements of the networked harassment campaign against Kamala Harris in those first few hours and days. But the aim is really to just explore them as these discourses as ethnosociologies. Like, what insight does that give us into the apprehensions, the fears within the Black community in terms of Kamala Harris and the Democratic Party more broadly? Because that's what I feel is more important. And so if you can recall, on January 21st, 2019, California Senator Kamala Harris declared her candidacy for the presidency of the United States. And despite being very popular among Democrats in California at the time, Harris's announcement was met with a lot of pushback, which is par for the course in politics. No politician is ever wholly liked by everyone on the political spectrum, and that's to be expected. However, as I argue today, the pushback reflected this distinct form of digitally assisted anti-Black misogyny that I call networked misogynoir. And so network misogynoir, it describes the phenomenon surrounding the specific communities, attitudes, behaviors, lexicons, and practices that form around and support digital media that vilifies Black women. And of course, misogyny and misogynoir, which is specifically the hatred of Black women as expressed through popular culture, has always existed in digital and non-digital media contexts, especially when it comes to women who dare to enter into public space. However, what makes networked misogynoir unique is that entire communities are forming around these ideas and using the lower barriers to cultural production online to produce content that not only further amplifies these narratives, but also recruits people to rally behind these banners. And so critical internet studies scholars, media study scholars, communication and feminist scholars have called online violence against women by many names: online hate, e-bile, gender trolling, digital violence, and online misogyny. Specifically, communication scholars Sarah Benet Weiser and Kate Miltner have used networked misogyny to describe the more intentional and organized forms of harm against women online. However, most literature on online violence only briefly mentions how non-white women online experience these harms. And then also, it doesn't always think about or consider the less tangible cultural impact that these discourses have. And I want to just amplify that a little bit or take a beat there, because I feel like that is really at the heart of this project, is thinking about how, like, yes, politics is very important, and we have to think about the political history of how some of these tropes are being weaponized in digital spaces. But we also cannot think of Black folks as research subjects only because of how they impact electoral politics. So beyond electoral politics, so including but beyond that, we also have to think about how these stereotypes, these harmful narratives and discourses impact people in their everyday lives, the everyday politics that impact how they relate to their partners, how they relate to their children, and what kind of dangers this rhetoric puts people in the day-to-day, even when the rhetoric is being leveraged against someone that's not them, a politician, perhaps. And so one of the biggest arguments I make in the larger book manuscript is that, you know, these things are personally harmful, and we have to think about that not only in terms of how it harms Black women, but the broader community and also electoral politics and other things. Okay, so the concept of network misogynoir, returning to that, merges these three concepts: Lee Rainey and Barry Wellman's concept of networked individualism, Sarah Benet Weiser's concept of networked popular misogyny, and Moya Bailey's concept of misogynoir, to identify and address the ways individuals connect socially around content that vilifies Black women in particular. And in networked, the new social operating system, Lee Rainey and Barry Wellman make the argument that the hyperconnectivity of modern social life creates opportunities for new patterns of networking and connection, namely movement away from traditionally tight-knit groups such as families and towns and things and civic groups, and towards less structured, socially networked groups that traverse spatial and temporal limitations. Their concept of networked individualism underscores the explosion of grassroots creators and niche media content that blurs the boundaries between traditional powerful media entities and the new media intermediaries such as influencers, content creators, meme aggregator pages, etc. And so Benet Weiser and Kate Milner's framing of network popular misogyny describes how misogyny interacts with the hyperconnectivity of the socially mediated internet. Network popular misogyny manifests itself in a variety of asocial activities on the internet geared toward policing women's bodies and autonomy, ranging from the asocial to the outright hateful, including revenge porn, swatting, doxing, and a host of other coordinated forms of harassment in digital spaces that they coordinate in spaces like Reddit or 4chan or things that are more veiled. And so the concept of networked misogynoir, my concept, builds on both of these to signify the emergent phenomenon of people connecting and building online communities around their shared hatred of Black women, whether that's implicitly or explicitly stated. A common thread between networked individualism and networked misogyny is that many new social formations provide constant support for individuals searching for specific communities that are perhaps marginal. And as we know, the promise of social connectivity based on marginalized interests has both negative and positive potential. Some people seek out positive community spaces online, while others connect around asocial interests, as we've seen. For instance, the individuals who gather and bond over their racist views may experience social isolation in the real world. However, online, someone who thinks and feels just like them is always online, ready to commiserate with them. But I think my biggest question is, if we know that people are going on the internet because of social isolation, because they're seeking a sense of community, why is this the particular community that they're seeking out? Why are these types of communities that they find to be the most enriching and engaging? This is especially concerning considering the background of histories and my own personal understanding of how anti-Black sexist tropes have been weaponized historically in political campaigns, but also to create narratives that justify dehumanizing Black women or justify enacting harm and violence against them. I know that all of the tropes of misogynoir that various Black feminists have articulated tend to correct directly to white supremacist narratives. So why would this be something that would be super popular in a Black space amongst Black men and also Black women? And what kind and who would want to like signal this kind of discourse when they're also signaling being Black community Black community oriented. Okay, and so for this study, I analyzed comments from, oh, sorry, I skipped a few slides. For this study, I analyzed comments from the Shade Room regarding Kamala Harris. I used critical discourse analysis and critical techno-cultural discourse analysis, which is an approach to thinking about how discourse is shaped and also shapes digital technology, and a little bit of digital ethnography. So some interviews were involved in this. And so if you're not familiar with the Shade Room, it's kind of akin to a Black TMZ. It focuses on entertainment news that is relevant to Black audiences. And while it doesn't exclusively cover Black celebrities, it prioritizes Black cultural news and is known for its detailed coverage of minor celebrity, what I call micro gossip. So it's very in-app. Like they're oftentimes reporting on what celebrities have followed who said what on their live, who's in the comment section, as in addition to also offline news. And so I find the Shade Room serves as a vital public space for a subset of Black Americans. And it's a hybrid space that combines elements of privacy and public discourse, which fosters conversations that might otherwise be reserved for private or semi-private settings. Now, to be clear, everything on the Shade Room is public, but because it is such an inherently Black space, it has the feel and the veneer that there's only Black people that are engaging in this space, because that's most of the commentary, that's most of the content. But we know that if it's online, it's public, there are definitely people who are surveilling and watching who are outside of the community and may just be interested in these topics as well, or might be paying attention for some other reason. And so the primary sites of analysis that I focused on was like the campaign rally announcement in Oakland, which happened on Martin Luther King Day in 2019. And then also her appearance on The Breakfast Club. The Breakfast Club, again, being another radio show that is popular within a certain subset of Black community. And so for this research, I primarily relied on manually collecting and analyzing the data, a method that is not always the most efficient, but deeply valuable in terms of understanding the subtleties of Black culture, because there are tools that exist to scrape the data, and there's sentiment analysis tools that will read it, and you can maybe get a bigger body of data from that. But I chose a hands-on approach because hand coding allows me to be closer in with the discourse so that I can really see for myself what some of those themes are. And also, I think that this approach is really important in terms of thinking about Black culture, because there's so many nuances to the humor in that space. And in fact, that was one of the notable challenges in the data collection and analysis, was deciphering the intention behind certain comments, especially those with ironic or like troll-like humor, which is prevalent in Black social media discourse. And so to address this, I analyzed these things by hand. I also focus especially on posts about Kamala Harris's Breakfast Club interview that came up, and the analysis helped me identify emerging themes and patterns in this discourse. And so to ensure the reliability of the findings, I also collaborated with another scholar to ensure the encoder reliability. And so after collecting and coding the data, we independently developed coding schemes, created a shared code book, and then cross-validated our analyses by swapping our work. I did this for my colleague on another project too. And so this is how we kind of work to ensure that kind of like rigor. And so I think I have like an issue with some of these next slides coming up. So I'm going to try to talk through a lot of this rather than show you too many of the tweets and things that I pulled. But examining the initial public response to Kamala Harris's presidential campaign announcement, the online backlash against Kamala encompassed several dominant discourses, and these discourses can very predictably be divided into two primary categories. Half were about, well, not half, but some about her political track record and some about her identity. But I will say that in the first 24 hours, something like 75 to 80% of the data that I collected was specifically talking about her identity. And above everything else, this kind of talking point that Kamala Harris is not Black, which was clarified to she's not African American, which was then clarified to, well, her parents are not descendants of Africans who were enslaved in America, which at the time in 2019 was a talking point that was being taken up by some particular political groups that mix their pro-Blackness with a little tinge of xenophobia. And I'm not going to name them right now, but I do go more into depth about the book. But I feel like a lot of the discourse reflected some of the political conversations that they were having. So one major theme being questioning her Blackness. But in this question about her Blackness was also notably amplified by Donald Trump Jr., who retweeted something from Ali Alexander, who is a conservative right-wing influencer. I do not want to get this wrong, but I do believe that he either identifies as Black or he identifies as a person of color. We'll say that. And so he is one of the people who tweeted this talking point about her being not Black, that a lot of scholars kind of suspected was a part of an astroturfing campaign. Astroturfing meaning people creating a dialogue by having a bunch of accounts tweet out the same narrative at the same time, because so many of the tweets word for word said that, like, Kamala Harris is not African-American Black, or some kind of weird little language like that. And so contrary to the birtherism claims that followed Barack Obama, I felt, what I noticed was that Kamala Harris's criticism centered around her being at a Canadian boarding school, and all of these weird little cherry-picked facts that were interesting because unlike Barack Obama, like, she definitely grew up in a Black neighborhood in a Black city of Oakland, California. She also went to a historically Black university, and she also was a part of a Black sorority membership. But what we saw in having this conversation was a lot of people moving around those pieces of identity to say, well, this is a part of a larger ploy to gain affinity within the Black community. And so there were comparisons made between her and Rachel Dolezal, which is the white woman who identifies as transracial, who also attended Howard University and embedded herself in the Black community without ever identifying that she was not actually Black. And so one of the second things that came up is just about her personal life, the people she's dated, and the stereotype of her sleeping her way to the top, which is a very nasty thing to say about somebody, especially a politician, and is very aside of the point of politics. There was a narrative that she hates Black men, and also that she was a Democratic Party token. And now, very notably, a lot of these stereotypes, I will point out, track really well with these tropes of misogynoir, the controlling images frameworks put forth by feminist scholars such as Patricia Hill Collins. So in thinking about, the Kamala and her social or personal life, it tracks onto Jezebel stereotypes. Kamala hates Black men, connects to the matriarchal stereotype. And then also the Democratic Party token also speaks to a prevalent talking point during this time of the bedwench, so the Black woman who is in a partnership with a white person who endears herself to white people and also sells our community to those folks. And so I can, oh, sorry, one more slide. And so in a lot of this, I saw that Kamala's identity a lot of these stereotypes were consistent, but then also these identity attacks were often connected to groups that were centered on some variation of nationalist rhetoric. And I'm not saying that whether it's good or bad, but I'm saying that a lot of these groups mix this interesting form of Black communal love and nationalism also with a weird undertone of misogyny and hatred. And so I kept finding these influencers promoting these talking points in there. Notably, one particular influencer has a history of being involved in pickup artistry. So that very misogynistic space of, how to manipulate women. And then also I found that the identity attacks reflected a lot of a growing animosity with the disdain for the Democratic Party overall, and specifically their quote unquote empty symbolic gestures. And I think that was one of the most important things that I got out of this project and doing some of the data analysis was thinking about how can I hold two things, right? How can I understand that these tropes are harmful and they need to be intervened on, but also understanding where they're coming from as a way toward intervention? So another way to think about something as simple as like the bedwench trope and her being, likening herself to white power structures is also thinking about what fears Black communities have about that, what other leaders have done these types of things in the past, and then also what is the Democratic Party doing to make Black people feel as though they're doing empty symbolic gestures. Well, I mean, spoiler alert, I feel like, some of that is happening, but I think we have to pay more attention to what the language is trying to say rather than thinking about just killing the narrative altogether. And so I know in the interest of time, I'm going to stop there and hand over the mic, but I'm happy to answer more questions in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we'll have Dr. Danielle Lemi. And for those of you who joined a little late, Dr. Lemi is going to present her research, and then we will do a Q&A for both scholars.
Thank you. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Dr. Hancock, can you confirm that you can see my screen?
Yes, go right ahead.
Perfect. Thank you so much. All right. Well, hi, everyone. My name is Danielle Lemi, and I'm a Tower Center Fellow at Southern Methodist University. I'm really excited to be here and talk to y'all about how I've studied Kamala Harris as part of a broader agenda on representation in American politics. And today I'll be talking about some ideas in my book project, as well as some new ideas that have developed beyond my book project. By the end of this talk, I want you to take away 4 things. First, I argue that politicians of color perform what I call identity labor with various political stakeholders. Second, politicians with mixed ancestry, like Kamala Harris, use identity labor to communicate group membership, often because of how they look. Third, descriptive representation, an important concept in political science, ignores this phenomenon and defines representatives by a white supremacist concept, biological essentialism. And I argue that shifting from descriptive representation to what I call identity representation relieves this tension and draws our focus to what matters, how representatives behave as a result of their identity. So before I get into it, I want to briefly talk about my background. Political scientists often don't do this, but I do think it's important to talk about our personal connections to the work because that's often what inspires us to ask the questions that we do. So I'm Mexican and Filipino. I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area in California in a hometown, Union City, that was around 50% Asian growing up. And I had a mostly Filipino social network and cultural upbringing. And in California, people often think I'm white. In Texas, I'm Latina. Sometimes doctors think I'm white. And in professional settings, for the most part, I am Latina. And my own experiences with contextual classification and group membership drive my agenda. And my research agenda for the last, I don't even know, 10 years has revolved around this question. What does it mean to be a descriptive representative? And to elaborate on that, how do you know one when you see one? And what does including mixed representatives in our analysis of representation reveal about how we theorize and study descriptive representation? In my book, I use mixed representatives, or those with mixed ancestry, to interrogate these questions and lay bare some of our faulty assumptions about descriptive representatives. Now, in political science, political theorist Jane Mansbridge defines descriptive representatives as individuals who, in their own backgrounds, mirror some of the more frequent experiences and outward manifestations of belonging to the group. I'm going to come back to this definition later, but in my book, I argue that politicians with mixed ancestry, like Kamala Harris, disrupt descriptive representation as we know it because they can highlight aspects of their heritage at politically opportune moments. So enter Kamala Harris in 2020. Many of you will recall the discourse surrounding her primary campaign and her selection as VP. Political scientists and sociologists alike wrote critical pieces on the disconnect between her status as a Black woman and the consequences of her work as a prosecutor in the Bay Area, as well as how the media classified her racially. And I think what was really interesting is that folks were getting at this gap in expectations of who many wanted Harris to be and how they wanted her to identify and who she actually was. And in her own words, Harris is aware of this. So in her memoir, she reflects on her time as a prosecutor and her view of crime. And she says, "Some people were surprised I was so relentless. And I know some others questioned how I, as a Black woman, could countenance being part of the machine, putting more young men of color behind bars." In my co-author work on Harris, we analyzed her memoir, and we argue that while some might argue that her record doesn't match what we'd expect of her as a Black woman, we argue that Harris has been clear about defining who she is. She is a neoliberal with politics similar to other Black politicians in her era. She has defined herself, and we accept that narrative as her own definition of herself. She's very clear about who she is, who she's been, and where she's going. And expectations for Harris, expectations of Harris's identity also go back to 2016 when she ran for US Senator against Loretta Sanchez. So in one study, I analyzed data from the 2016 National Asian American Survey, and I found that Black Californians who believed race was important to their identity were less likely to prefer Harris over Sanchez when she was framed as of African American and Asian American descent versus not categorized at all. And so I argue that because Harris is widely known as a Black politician in California, framing her as having multiple heritages may be misaligned with what voters expect. Likewise, in other research, I've also found that Indian Americans are less likely to support a Biden-Harris ticket when Harris is framed as Black and Indian compared to being framed as Indian alone. And this is true for Indian Americans who believe that Indian Americans have something in common. So there's clearly something about being classified to two ethno-racial categories that disrupts how voters evaluate Harris and leads them to evaluate her less favorably. So in my book, I argue that politicians like Harris have to perform identity labor to close the distance, close this gap in expectations between who they are ethno-racially and what others expect of them. And so I define identity labor as the public, transactional, politically consequential work that politicians must perform to manage the public's perceptions of their identity in our constructed reality, so-called reality, of ethno-race. And to be clear, I'm not arguing that they are confused or that they're lying. I'm arguing that they are strategic. And in recent times, Harris has performed identity labor to manage how people see her ethno-racial identity. So I'll give you an example. You might remember when she ran for president, she uploaded a video with Mindy Kaling, Indian American comedian, in which they cooked together and discussed their shared Indian heritage. So there's a really interesting segment of their conversation that exemplifies identity labor. In one part, Kaling tells Harris that people don't always know Harris is Indian. And Harris tells Kaling, yes, you look like the entire one half of my family. So, of course, this is scripted, it's strategic, and the point of this video and this conversation is to let Indian Americans know that Harris is, in fact, Indian with Indian family and knows how to cook Indian food. But it's interesting for two reasons. So first, Kaling and Harris, they're explicitly clarifying Harris's background for those who don't know or are unclear. Yes, she is Indian. Two, Harris is addressing why people don't know she's Indian because of how she looks, because we still tie biological characteristics like skin tone, eye shape, nose shape, hair texture, and so on to group membership. And she tells Kaling, you look like my family. She doesn't say, we look alike, you look like me, because she recognizes that people perceive her as a Black woman. And as a result, people don't always know she's Indian. And she's claiming her family, her biological relationships, to establish credibility as Indian American. She performed identity labor again in her speech at the Democratic National Convention, drawing on language and community traditions to establish credible group membership. And so you may recall she used the Tamil word for aunts to refer to her aunts who are important to her. And she referenced her relationship to Black Greek letter organizations to demonstrate a long-held connection to African Americans in particular. And so what was interesting about this speech is that she uses family again, blood, biology, to show her identity as Indian American. But she uses her community membership, her service, not blood, to a Black Greek letter organization to show her identity as African American. So because of how she looks, she has to reference these biological relationships to Indians to credibly claim her Indian American group membership, while she uses actual past commitments and actions to claim her African American group membership. And so while the first two examples show what she's done on the campaign trail, I also analyzed how she's described herself on her website biography over time. I found that generally she's consistently identified as African American and has used Indian, or the word Indian, on her website biography just a few times to identify her mother during her 2010 California Attorney General campaign. Coincidentally, when the electorate expanded from just San Francisco to the entire state of California, which has a large Asian American population. So again, Harris performs identity labor to be strategic and close the distance between herself and the communities she may have greater distance from because of how she looks, specifically Indian Americans. And this article in the Washington Post reported that in 2010, even Indian American donors didn't realize she was Indian American. So again, to be clear, Harris is not confused about who she is, and she's not lying. She's strategically managing the public's perceptions of her identity. And so this brings me back to the question I think about often. How do you know a descriptive representative when you see one? What does including mixed representatives, those with mixed ancestry, like Harris, reveal about how we theorize and study representation? Now, going back to the definition of descriptive representatives, you'll see that a component of descriptive representation rests on biological essentialism. I interpret these outward manifestations of belonging to the group as those physical characteristics that we map to group membership, again, like skin tone, hair texture, nose shape, eye shape, and so on. Harris is often perceived as a Black woman, and based on this definition, it raises the question, would she count? Does she count as an Indian American descriptive representative according to this definition? And so herein lies the problem with descriptive representation. It relies on biological essentialism, a white supremacist concept that one, race is real, race can be seen, and these physical characteristics define who counts in each of these racial categories. It doesn't account for the fact that some representatives will highlight or mute aspects of their ethno-racial identity as needed or as the context allows. And it also creates expectations for behavior based on ancestry or even based on how you look. And so I argue that when it comes to the relationship between ethno-race and representation in particular, we need to move from descriptive representation to what I call identity representation. And I define identity representation as representatives who share kinship, ancestry, and identities with constituents who align politically with those identities, who leverage those identities to act for those communities, and who act in solidarity with marginalized people against oppression from dominant groups. And in this formulation of representation, I'm drawing from Black feminist thought, Combahee River Collective's notion of identity politics, intersectionality, and legal scholarship to focus on what a representative does to dismantle oppression as a result of their own interpretation and their conscious alignment with their ethno-racial identities. And in my book, I use mixed representatives to interrogate all of these questions. And I use mixed representatives to develop this concept. So to summarize, these are 4 things you should take away. Politicians of color perform identity labor with various political stakeholders. They'll do this with the media, they'll do this with constituents, they'll do this within the legislature with their colleagues and other legislators. Politicians with mixed ancestry, like Kamala Harris, must explicitly communicate group membership, often because of how they look. One way to do this is to appeal to biological relationships. You can claim your family to establish credibility. Descriptive representation ignores identity labor and defines descriptive representatives by a white supremacist concept, biological essentialism. You have to look a certain way to be a member of a group, and because you look a certain way, you're going to act a certain way. And shifting from descriptive representation to identity representation relieves this tension. And so this brings me to some other questions I'd like to tackle in future research. I'd like to think about, where do politicians with mixed ancestry fit into redistricting battles and efforts to elect more representatives of color? How should we be thinking of identity representatives within the context of the Voting Rights Act? And second, does a shift to identity representation mean that ethno-race no longer matters for the political empowerment of communities of color? It is the case that a lot of right-wing conservatives would likely use the mixed race population to argue that race no longer matters, and use this population to justify gutting efforts, to make the United States more just and more equitable. And so these are a couple questions that I'd like to think about in my future research. All right, thank y'all for listening.
Well, thank you both very much. I am so thrilled that we're going to have a great conversation. For those of you who are online, we have a Q&A function that you can use to post a question that you might have. We've had several comments, but also if you have questions, please use the Q&A function online. In the room, our colleague, our Kerwin team member, Glennon Sweeney, is going to be helping us kind of moderate and make sure that we answer questions. And while people are kind of germinating and thinking, reflecting on these 2 amazing presentations, I had a question for each of you to get us started, and then happy to kind of hear from other folks as well. So Dr. Lemi, you kind of left off where I was kind of picking up with regard to the Voting Rights Act and thinking about the ways in which the Voting Rights Act in particular, whether at the federal level or for the few states that have statewide voting rights acts, the way we define what counts, right, as a majority minority district is grounded in descriptive representation, right? Like the legal question is, do they have a reasonable chance of electing someone who looks like them, right? So, I mean, exactly to your point. So I did want to hear what you think. I know you haven't done the research yet, but what are the stakes? What's at stake as we think about, this transition to identity representation? And I ask that to say, what do you think identity representation could offer us in this voting rights kind of space that descriptive representation clearly can't? Because, I mean, obviously it was gutted a couple of years ago by the Supreme Court. And then for Dr. Gipson, I was listening to your presentation and I just could not get Shay Moss and Ruby Freeman, the 2 Georgia poll workers, who have just recently won a defamation case, a multi-million-dollar defamation case against Rudolph Giuliani, as I was thinking about this digital harassment. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the connections between what happens when it's applied to someone who's very prominent, who's voluntarily in the public sphere, like a Kamala Harris, right? She announced she was going to run for president. Nobody asked her to run for president per se, but she put herself out there to do that, versus how it works in a social media space when people are pulled into it through no fault of their own. And I didn't know if there were different implications, or if your work more broadly has looked at kind of the differences between someone who's voluntarily putting themselves in the public sphere and somebody who's kind of dragged into the public sphere, not of their own volition, if that makes sense.
Danielle, did you want to go first?
Yeah, I can go first. So thank you so much, Dr. Hancock, for that question. So of course I haven't done the research, but I can tell you what I think based on the research that I have done. So on the candidate side, my work suggests that identifying a politician as, mixed or with, two ethno-racial categories, it is beneficial when they're being compared to a candidate who is not mixed and appealing to a broad swath of the electorate. But members of their own groups may not react favorably to them being mixed. They may actually prefer someone who is not mixed. But in my mind, when I think about other work that's been done, like Christian Phillips, Nowhere to Run, thinking about, chances of women of color getting elected, I actually think that mixed representatives have an advantage over representatives who are not mixed. It's rooted in colorism. It's rooted in featureism. There's this assumption that mixed people, they're more beautiful, they're more attractive, they're more intelligent, this and that. It goes back to, the idea of biological essentialism and these racist tropes, in the early 1900s and so on. But I think that there is a real danger for the GOP to seize on the rise of mixed candidates and use them for regressive aims, and use them to say, race doesn't matter. Look at all these beautiful candidates we're producing. It doesn't matter. Let's gut all of these programs. Let's not have reparations. Let's not have the VRA. They can use this population and these candidates to justify, regressive politics. One of the things that I think identity representation pushes us towards to is evaluating, what up until now have been called descriptive representatives more critically. So in my mind, it doesn't serve marginalized communities just because you're a member of that group. If you're pro-capitalist, if you're pro-empire, how can you fight for that group? How can you dismantle oppression and still be on the side of systemic oppression? And so it's going to push voters and push communities to, continue to have more stringent criteria for who should be representing them. And here I'm thinking of, Julian Womble's work on Black voters and evaluating Black candidates. So those are my initial thoughts to your question.
Yeah, thank you for the question as well. It is very similar and also completely different when you are a public figure and are the victim of a networked harassment campaign than when you're a private citizen. It's similar because the volume, the tenor, all of that can be scary. But for politicians and people who have elected to be in the public space, they often have somewhat of a more of awareness of what's coming and have protections around it. Ordinary citizens may not even be aware that this is a cost of being in the public space. And so when I think about what happened with Shay Moss and Ruby Freeman, it's like, they were harassed relentlessly. People come into their door. They had to figure out what the source of the problem was, because oftentimes what you'll see is that, there's all this organization and conversation and sharing of personal information happening on Reddit and not Reddit, but 4chan and other message boards. And then all of a sudden it hits the private individual in real life and they have to figure out what it's actually related to. The thing about those poll workers is they didn't know the narratives that were going around them until it showed up on their doorstep. And so I've talked to a ton of folks who have been victims of this, whether they be high profile politicians or maybe a lower profile but still high profile journalists and ordinary citizens. And I feel like their experiences are all different, especially in terms of the aftercare part of like, okay, now I know what's going on, what can I do? It's hard to have these conversations with local police stations. It's hard to have these conversations even with therapists who don't really understand. A lot of people's common response is, well, just turn it off, it's just the internet. But people are being recognized in the streets and then having their information released online. Like, that's really scary, especially for vulnerable populations, women, people who have children at home, people of color. And so, yeah, it's different, but also the same. And there's not so much of a safety network for it, because for a lot of years, the social media platforms just ignored it in the same way. Like, it's not a big deal, just unplug, until they realized they couldn't ignore it, because it was having real life implications for people in a way that was unable to be controlled. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Both of you answered the questions. I appreciate it. Glennon, do we have anyone in the room who'd like to ask a question? And if you don't mind just saying your name, just so we all know who's asking the question.
Yes, we do. Okay, you want to go ahead, Jonathan?
Yeah, Jonathan Baker, can you hear me? Dr. Andrew. Okay, so I'll speak up for a little bit. This question is for Dr. Gipson in reference to the tropes and the, I guess, virility or the vitriol, the hatred, if you will. Can you talk about if you notice a contrast in the depth of the, I guess, attack, the strength of the attack on Kamala Harris, from the Breakfast Club interview with Charlemagne and Envy and those guys. Did you notice a difference in the tenor from from a racial standpoint, like those, so like the shade was mostly kind of more black oriented, you could say, but like you see like a stronger attack from those within the black community compared to those without the black community?
I'm sorry, is your question just like in terms of like racialized and gendered like attacks against Kamala Harris, am I seeing more of that discourse within Black groups than white groups or non-Black groups? No. Huh?
We'll go with that.
Yeah. No, I think like one important thing in my work is to like trace these tropes back to white supremacist discourses. These discourses are not endemic or inherent to Black communities. They're seeded narratives. And so when I'm looking at some of the white supremacist, far right, like conservative spaces, they're saying worse things almost, they're saying more dehumanizing things. And there's more of them. So the volume feels like there's more. There's just more non-Black people in the United States than there are Black people. So it always feels like there's more. I feel like the racialized and gendered attacks in Black discursive spaces take on a different tenor, because and I don't know the best way to describe this, but it almost feels more personal. Kamala almost comes up as, I don't want to say property, but as something that either does or does not belong to the Black community. And that's why those narratives around her being Black or not Black come up so often, because it's like, is this even us paying attention to this, or is this just a Democratic ploy? Is she a part of our community? Is she not? And this desire to deny her in those spaces comes from this personal way that they're interacting with her. But at the end of the day, a trope like a Jezebel, if someone's saying like, oh, she just slept her way up to the top, or the weirdest rumor for me was like, she went to a Black college so she could have access to Black men. No one ever explained like what that does or what that actually means, but it's this narrative rooted in thinking about her as just a sexual object, or dehumanizing her in particular ways that we've seen in generations before, when the Jezebel trope was created as a counter to the Black buck. This idea that Black women cannot be raped. Black women do not have the same sort of purity. And so these attacks on their sexuality. And so I try my best to remind people that even though I'm talking about how these conversations happen in Black spaces, I try to connect them to where they came from and why they're happening. Specifically with Kamala, in the day that she announced that she was running, there was literally so many tweets with the exact same language that people said this is astroturfing. And I don't know if you remember around the 2016 election, but it was found that it was so many pages on groups on Facebook, but also on Twitter that were just putting out pro-Black content, quotes, Martin Luther King picture, Malcolm X. And then as the election went on, it started to ramp up and they started to kind of have different narratives. They were seeding conversations. And so the Kamala top cop thing is something that was seeded and took on legs because as all disinformation and misinformation operates, it's a little truth in all of it, right? Like for a disinformation or misinformation campaign to work really well, it has to be seated in some sort of truth. And at the end of the day, you know, she had that job and she did those things. Maybe all of the details about what she did when she was in office or who she was are messed up. But once you're primed to feel like this is someone from outside of your community, she's an outsider, she's other, it's easy to be more susceptible to the lies that were being told because they're mixed in with that truth. So I hope that answers the question, but I guess I would say that I would not say that it's more of this in Black communities. I would say that this is more happening in non-Black communities and specifically those that are circulating white supremacist discourses, because that's what that is. I just know that white supremacist discourses also circulate in our community as well.
Thank you very much. Dr. Lemi, wanted to ask you, there were 2 or 3 folks online who were asking about Nikki Haley. So wanted to have you talk a little bit about her. Of course, Nikki Haley, to my knowledge, is not mixed race or biracial, but just wanted to have you comment a little bit because I think there were 2 questions and then maybe a comment about her.
Yes, for the folks who asked the questions in the chat, I do believe that part of why we don't hear much about Nikki Haley's Indian American heritage is in part because of how she looks. It's in part of how she presents herself as well. I mean, maybe because I'm from California and I'm very familiar with Harris even before she ran for office. A big part of her personal story is her mom, her Indian mother. That is a major part of who she is. She's always talking about her mom. Her mother had a great deal of influence on her. I don't follow Nikki Haley that closely. I'm not following the GOP politicians that closely, but I feel like I just don't hear that as much from Nikki Haley. And so part of this is her own choice, perhaps, to play that down in the GOP primary. Should she make it to the general, perhaps we'll hear a lot more about her Indian heritage and her parents and how influential they were on her.
Great, thank you. Glenn, another question from the room?
Sorry, I was running over to tell you I had another question in the room and I wanted to unmute this. Yes, Charlie, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question that I would like the reactions of both speakers on. First of all, I'm a very old guy, and secondly, I'm a bit of an amateur historian. And so I can recall in 1968, LBJ Johnson was considered not a strong candidate, too old, unpopular, and there was strong draft Humphrey sentiment before Johnson dropped out. He did drop out, but that his vice president would be a stronger candidate. I remember in 1980, Jimmy Carter was not considered very strong, and there was a strong draft Fritz Mondale, his vice president, to replace him on the ticket, which didn't happen, obviously. I can remember in 1984, Reagan was in his late 60s. He was considered way too old and had lost it. It was suffering from dementia and so forth. So there was a strong movement to have his vice president replace him because Reagan in 1984 wasn't seen as particularly strong. Then you go to 2000, to cut my question short here, though, go to 2024, and there is a perception that Biden's not the strongest candidate, and he might be a little too old and so forth, but I do not perceive any kind of sentiment for drafting his vice president to run instead. And I guess I'm baffled by that because there's just been too many historical situations where the vice president, who frankly, some of those vice presidents had far weaker resumes than our current vice president has. And I would just wonder what you would attribute that lack of interest in the Democratic Party in drafting Biden's vice president to be a candidate in 2024.
I'm trying to think. I would, I, I'm trying not to be too political here, but I'm thinking about what happened. I'm also from the state of California too, so I knew Kamala before. Like, I think that's also why this presentation, this research was interesting for me, because it seemed like almost overnight there was a narrative going about her, where it's like people had criticisms of her and her political track record in California, but none of the identity attacks were happening in the state of California. This is someone I had already voted for senator, you know. But I think in the current political atmosphere that we're in, I am guessing right now, sir, I feel like, and I'm very biased by the research that I do in thinking about how all of these these anti-woman, like anti-reactionary, anti-feminist rhetorics are very popular in digital spaces right now. And considering what happened with Hillary Clinton's candidacy, where the Democrats thought she was a shoo-in the entire time, all the way up until the night of, I think they're just a little bit hesitant of running a candidate that is a woman in a time like this. And I could be very, very wrong. I have no idea. I'm not a political strategist, but just going off what we've seen in recent history, it is a very scary time. And I'm noticing a lot of politicians and a lot of constituents afraid of taking any sort of risks in this moment, because the Democratic Party is definitely going against a very popular Republican candidate in Donald Trump. I know people don't want to say it, but he's very popular right now. And so Democratic Party ran a woman before. They might be nervous to run that again. Also, for all the reasons that we've stated here, there's a lot of narratives that are running against Kamala Harris in digital spaces that are going to make people also a little hesitant. And I'm sure they're doing some temperature checks and some polling on that in the background, and they're seeing those narratives running wild. I have no idea, though. My best guess.
I agree with a lot of what Dr. Gipson just said. And I will add to that, it is much easier to maintain the status quo than it is to inject a change in the current political moment. But I will also add, and perhaps I'm a little biased as well, and I say this as a millennial, that I think that someone like Kamala Harris represents an older guard of the Democratic Party, both Biden and Harris. And I don't believe that the Biden-Harris ticket is left enough to fire up millennial and Gen Z voters off the top of my head. It's my opinion.
I agree.
Great. Thank you both very much. So there is a question online for Dr. Gipson. Dr. Gipson, Anne-Marie Shoup is asking about the emotional labor and consequences of reading through so many identity-based attacks. So this is just kind of what's the impact on you as a scholar of kind of doing this research?
Yeah, I feel real weird answering this. I've gotten this question a few times and I feel really weird answering this. I have an emotional distance from it. I don't know if we have any astrology followers there. I'm an Aquarius. I just do not, I do not get taken in, because I realize that I'm reading stuff that is meant to be emotionally provocative, and I'm an extremely sympathetic person. So I'm looking for what people are actually trying to say that they don't have the language to say. So some people are attacking people on the basis of their identity because they just don't have a better language to explain their apprehensions and their fears. But then also there's a lot of ways that I feel sympathetic to people who, let's say I'm reading a bunch of comments that are just hateful toward Black women. I always feel bad for those people. I'm like, how awful would it be to live in a world where I'm that hateful, that angry, that sad, that I'm sitting on the internet doing this, and that's a scary place to be in mentally. And so I'm more so community oriented and thinking about it in a more holistic kumbaya kind of way. Maybe also blame my California granola-ness, but I just want people to think about what they're saying more so. I never take anything personal because it's not personal. Like a trope and a stereotype actually has zero to do with me. And it's sad for the people, not for me. So I just do not internalize that. And that's just who I am as a person. And I feel like that's what carries me in this work, because I can go through this stuff and I go, wow, that's sad for you. Hopefully the work that I'm doing will help you maybe in one way see this in a different perspective. And just as an example, just this idea that, like, you know, a lot of people say, well, these narratives, you're talking about these narratives in Black communities and Black people this, Black people that. I'm like, this is not Black stuff. This is actually something that's coming from white supremacy, that's being pushed at marginalized groups as an answer. They're being, like, people are being pushed to believe that women are the reason why they don't have things, as opposed to thinking about power structures that have worked against women and marginalized groups and poor people. So I feel like it's easy for me to do this work because I'm trying to have the nuanced conversation and open that up for groups. It's not something that I'm ever looking at face value and getting mad about, because it's ridiculous.
Thank you. So there were a couple of questions that came up about color and colorism. And then Dr. Lemi, you were also asked about how you self-identify. So if you want to start the conversation about color and colorism, but start with the answer to that question and then pivot to some of the comments about people were asking, should we talk about colorism in communities and not just kind of race or ethnicity specifically?
Sure. So I can address the questions about colorism. This is one aspect that is relevant to any discussion of Kamala Harris. You know, she is relatively lighter skinned. She wears her hair straight. And I think that for folks who are probably stronger on any kind of scale in which you would measure anti-Blackness, she herself is probably slightly more palatable because she is mixed, right? And so people may bring this perspective that she's quote unquote less Black because she has an Indian mother. And then she's also lighter skinned, and then she also wears her hair straightened. In my other work with Nadia Brown on Black women, political elites and the politics of appearance, we actually focused on Black voters and Black women politicians and how they saw themselves. For whatever reason, colorism was just not a prominent theme in our conversations with both voters, folks who run for office, folks who are considering office, and folks who are already in office. There was a strong emphasis on experiencing discrimination based on how they wore their hair. In terms of my own background, I see that, you know, there's a question about that. You know, I do believe that Filipino Americans are marginalized in the United States. How many Filipinos do you know are in office or in positions of power? You know, my ancestors were former colonial subjects, and I do identify strongly and align myself with the politics of women of color. And I think about the Third World Women's Alliance. You know, I support anti-capitalism, anti-colonialism. So that is how I align myself. And I think that there's another great question in the chat on, like, how should we, you know, think about how people use, you know, the term BIPOC. You know, for my own opinion is that because the term BIPOC, people of color, has become so popularized, and perhaps Dr. Hancock, you might say memeified on social media and popular discourse, it is so disconnected from being political. And so you hear this all the time in workspaces, on university campuses, when people talk about DEI, BIPOC this, BIPOC that. They're using BIPOC to substitute for Black people often, but often people will say, oh, I'm a person of color, just because they don't burn in the sun, right? Saying I am a person of color, that is a political statement. Saying I am a woman of color, it is a political statement. I mean, you align yourself with the politics of this group, and you're going to fight for this group. You're going to act in solidarity with this group and other groups. And so to me, the way that we use the term BIPOC, the way it gets used in public discourse, it's very much divorced from politics. And I think that when people use that term and identify with that term specifically, people of color, women of color, it should be a political alignment.
Thank you very much. So, Dr. Gipson, there's a question. It kind of sounds like it's a question that would have come out of Dr. Lemi's research, but I think it also speaks to your research about the one drop rule and not being Black enough, right? So, that biological essentialism that Dr. Lemi was talking about. But I think the question is really more geared towards you and just that perception. I think the person says, is the narrative of Kamala Harris not being Black a new concept? And how it relates to kind of that age-old question of one drop of Black blood makes you Black. So do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, and I might not be fully understanding that in terms of, is it a new question? Because like you know, I was raised under one drop rule and the understanding that if you have a Black parent, you're Black. Like, what is that? But I think that it speaks to like people's narrow understandings of Blackness and what Black is. I had a conversation around this time when Kamala announced that she was running with my cousin, who was one of the people who was saying, "Oh, she's not Black, she's not Black." And I'm like, how is she not Black? Explain to me what you're trying to say. Because I was trying to understand the conversation as opposed to just dismiss it. And, you know, it switched from, like I said, and a lot of the data that I saw, but also in this conversation I had with my family member, is like, oh, well, she's not Black like us, right? And so sometimes people have narrow understandings of what Blackness is, and Blackness has to be rooted in also these narratives of struggle and trauma and pain, and you have to grow up in cities and certain communities, not really understanding that the Black experience is very expansive. Black people are all around the globe, all around the country, in big cities, small cities. We have different types of family dynamics, different types of interests, and those are all Black experiences. But then the conversation kind of devolved into, well, it's different to be a descendant of African slaves in America than to be someone who comes over as an immigrant. And it's like, sure, that is a different experience. But then there's also this way in which we have to acknowledge coalition and community that were not often talked about, right? So my cousin was making points. Well, you know, none of our leaders were from other countries. It's like, oh, that's not true. Like, you better look into the history of some of our Black leaders and their Caribbean parents, you know? And so there's this forgetting this or just not knowing about interconnected histories. And I'm really passionate about that. Like, how can we have more expansive understandings of Blackness? And also, what are you saying when you're saying she's not Black? Because you're not saying she's not Black. You know, she has a Black parent. What you're saying is that you don't feel like she can identify with the struggle that you're going through because of her class standing, because of her family orientation. And there's another way to say that, right? And that's a fair critique, but to belittle someone and deny them their identity is very reductive. So I don't think this is a new thing, especially when people don't phenotypically look Black. Kamala Harris phenotypically looks Black to me. She also looks Indian to me. She's both. But this isn't new, but it's an ongoing conversation because a lot of times people see Blackness as a monolith, as a certain set of identity markers and political kind of ideas, when it's really not that. And we know that, but we sometimes weaponize identity to push people out of the group.
Thank you. Glennon, do we have another question in the room?
We do not.
Oh, okay. Well, we do have a couple more questions in the chat. So we have a question from Joseph, who's asking about, and this is for either or both of you, based on the collective research and how she is received by different groups, could we predict how she would be received if there were a situation where President Biden had to step down and she became the president? And do we have any predictions about how the American people would respond either positively or negatively?
I think I wish the question wouldn't went away. I was still rereading it. It's okay. I think that you know, we got some bigger fish to fry in terms of that. I feel like you know, from what I noticed, and this is just again my bias from being a comm scholar and thinking about social media, the way that people perceive Kamala has so much to do with where they are getting their information from. If you are primarily getting your information from the shade room and the internet, you know, you're not going to like Kamala. You're not going to vote for her. Like, the consensus is very anti-Kamala amongst millennials in social media spaces. It's almost like it's everywhere. But then if you're learning about Kamala from the state of California or through mainstream media, like you probably will likely have a more favorable view of her. And I know this just from talking to older constituents who are not on social media, who aren't consuming all of these narratives online. And so I, again, am not a political statistician. I haven't run the numbers. I don't know how she's going to be perceived, but I know amongst the millennial and probably younger to Gen Z social media folks, it's very much a negative perception of Kamala Harris in that space.
I'll add to that. I think it'll be conditional on, different sections of the Democratic Party and their own political ideologies. I think that your, bread and butter liberals will probably support a Harris ticket no matter what if Biden, steps down. But I do think folks who are farther left, folks who are younger, millennial, Gen Z, I think they're going to have a lot of questions. I'm thinking about a poll that the University of Chicago did. I think it's the Gen Forward project. I think that younger voters are going to have a lot of questions about how the Biden-Harris administration handled Israel's siege on Gaza. There's going to be a lot of criticism coming out of that, especially in some of these swing states. And that's something I think we should keep an eye on.
Yes, I think the other thing, I'll just weigh in here. I didn't present our paper that we have on Kamala Harris about the way in which her work on immigration and the root causes of migration were socially constructing her identity. We can think some of the research has shown about women of color candidates, and this is true in Britain, this is true in the United States, it's true in a number of different countries. People, love women when they're in office, hate them as candidates. So there's something negative about the way in which women are portrayed as ambitious or wanting something more for themselves that creates a certain kind of backlash, right? So you can see this polling. I actually won't use Kamala Harris. I'll use an entirely different politician. I'll use Hillary Clinton. If you look at how people felt about Hillary Clinton as a senator versus how they felt about her as a presidential candidate, right? And we are literally talking about she was one thing, then she became the next thing, right? She became Secretary of State, and then she ran for president, right? So you think about these things and how when she's in office, there's a very good opinion, or comparatively good opinion of her when she's Secretary of State, when she's actually a member of the Senate. But then the negativity ramps up. I think that speaks to a lot of what Dr. Gipson is studying with regard to these are not messages that just kind of emanate from nowhere, right? These are targeted campaigns of mis and disinformation that are designed to ramp up the negativity around key moments in a political cycle, right? So that's the first thing. I think the other thing is there's also research about women candidates, and women of color candidates in particular, that has a 2x2 kind of matrix. The first kind of axis of that matrix is whether or not they're positively portrayed or negatively portrayed, right? So whether there are nasty things being said and written about them in the media, or whether there are positive things that are being said about them in the media. Then the other part of that matrix, the other part of the 2x2 table, is whether or not they're perceived as competent or not. And I think that's where there are a lot of research questions that would emerge if Kamala Harris were at some point to become president of the United States, to really talk about whether or not there are going to continue to be these identity-based attacks that we've heard Dr. Gipson talked about, that we've heard Dr. Lemi talk about, or whether they would pivot to more of a competence and incompetence, right? So if you contrast Harris with Clinton, no one on the face of the planet could ever question Clinton's competence, right? There was never a negative narrative that she was not competent, right? Because she was simply too smart and too competent and too qualified for that to ever land or stick. Again, based on the resume, if you think about the resume, if you think about the experiences that she had, so I'm not making a political statement there, I'm talking about the actual qualifications that line up, right, against any opponent she might have faced. So that was never a qualification. There have been, however, questions about competence on the Harris side that have been mostly around, well, she was picked as a token. She was picked because, she would score well with certain voters and doesn't necessarily have the qualifications that someone else has, right? And so again, that would be an open question to kind of think about whether or not we would have positive, negative, whether there would be a shift in terms of the amplification of more negative comments than already kind of are existing. And then also whether there would be questions about competence that might continue to arise. So I think both of those things would be things we would look out for as scholars when such a thing might happen, right? So if there were to be a situation where President Biden was stepping down and Vice President Harris was stepping up, as it were. We have about 5 minutes left. I'm going to do a quick check of the Q&A here. I don't see a ton of there's one last question about the anti-Black sentiment of foundation of the country. So I don't know, Dr. Lemi and Dr. Gipson, if you both want to just talk a little bit about this. I know, Dr. Lemi, you started to talk about Hamas, for example, but you want to just, each of you respond about how it's impacted your research personally.
Yeah, I can talk about my work beyond Kamala Harris. And so in the conversations that I've had with legislators, state legislators over time, what I have found is that the so-called one-drop rule, it structures how mixed representatives experience racialization. So there is a distinct difference between mixed representatives who are Black and who are not Black, and the experience of representatives who are Black. They experience the legacy of the one-drop rule, where people are very quick to enforce anti-Blackness on them. I had one legislator share with me that, when they first entered office, a colleague in the legislature referred to them, in their words, as a slur, an antiquated term to refer to mixed Black people in the 1900s. And so they experienced that. And on the flip side, their Blackness gets dismissed. And so that very much goes back to the foundation of the one-drop rule and anti-Blackness in this country. It structures how mixed Black politicians experience racialization.
I'm still thinking through the question. I don't think, okay, so anti-Black sentiment and how it comes up in my work, it has been a foundation. I feel like the way that people, the biggest impact from my work is like understanding how people understand anti-Blackness. And I realize that there's a huge disavowal of anti-Blackness when people don't realize that it does play a role in almost everything. There's a denial that it has a real salience or importance. But then also, because I'm talking about a woman, and because I'm talking about a woman, people in digital spaces have already been primed to dislike. It's hard for people to parse out how this is even an issue for anti-Blackness. People will say, well, that's a feminist issue, that's a gender issue. And I'm like, well, I'm talking about Black women specifically and tropes about Black women, which makes it a racial issue wholly. And so I just come up against like people who are saying like, well, this isn't anti-Black what I'm saying or doing. I just don't like Kamala because X, Y, and Z. And these are in my conversations and my interviews. And I'm like, okay, well, what about the politics? Like trying to get back to the political conversation is hard because people can't get past the identity conversation. And I don't think anything is new necessarily about this. I did see something recently. I was listening to a podcast where somebody was talking about President Barack Obama and everything that he was put through while he was in office, and how Trump is just able to do whatever he wants. And the journalist was like, that shows you how far we've come or how far we've regressed in those years. And I was like, nah, like the reason why Obama went through those things was because of anti-Blackness. And those things, like we could have switched the timelines and Obama could be the president now and Trump the president then. And Trump would still be able to do things that Obama is not able to do because of the way anti-Blackness works and the way that Black people have to police themselves through space. And so what some people get hung up on is like this comparison between Obama and Harris having similar backgrounds. Well, aren't they the same? Why is there so much, animosity toward Kamala? I'm like, okay, well, we are in a completely different social media moment. Obama was able to leverage social media platforms to his benefit. He was able to facilitate, like, seed his narratives in his own way. And now we're in this moment where we're still trying to figure out the technology and how these, narratives are getting seeded. And we're dealing with a woman who has all of these different stereotypes that are not, that are affixed to her, that are not understood anti-Black racism. So that's actually what's happening there. But we have a huge disavowal of the continuation of anti-Black sentiment and how it looks. It's constant, but also is changing over time, especially in different media contexts.
Well, that will be our final word on this conversation. Again, thank you very much for joining us, everyone online and also everyone in the room. We ask you to, again, please thank Dr. Danielle Lemi and Dr. Brookyne Gipson. We hope to see you. The next edition of the Kirwan Forum series will be on February 1st with Dr. Greg Leslie. And we are excited to host him as we were excited to host these amazing scholars. Thanks and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.